So welcome to Art History with the Artist and the Librarian, and today's program is the Dark Art of Caravaggio. There's going to be some art theft, a lot of bad behavior, and a little bit of murder ahead. So if you have any questions, add them to the chat box. And at the end of the program, if you want to discuss your thoughts on Caravaggio, that's when you're going to raise your hand. So there is a raise hand option. So Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio was born in Milan, Italy in 1571. Caravaggio's contemporaries, to kind of place you where you are in history, are going to be Galileo and Shakespeare. And in 1576, Milan had an outbreak of the bubonic plague. So our last art history it dealt with infectious disease, so we didn't escape it. Now we're jumping back to the bubonic plague, and his family wanted to stay a little bit safer, so they headed out of the big city of Milan and they went to their small native town of Caravaggio, which is where Caravaggio gets his nickname. And within a year, however, most of his family had passed away. At the age of 12, Caravaggio was signed a contract to work with Simone Pietrozano for 4 years. And that artist was a late Mannerist style painter in Milan. And so Mannerism, I kind of think of it as like the tail end of Renaissance, and they really hyper exaggerate the figure. So you're going to have, there's even one that's called Madonna with a long neck. So like all the body, like long legs, long fingers, long neck. That's what I think of when I think of Mannerism. And I know that there's more to it than that, but it's just the thing I think of immediately. Okay, so Caravaggio struggled getting started, and after he relocated to Rome in 1592, he fell ill and he was in the hospital for like 6 months. And this is actually a self-portrait of Caravaggio. So he had a mirror and he was painting himself, and it may have been malaria because his skin tone is very yellow and his eyes are yellow. And he did recover, but I think it's an interesting fact about this painting that he painted himself and he was recovering from an illness. In Greco-Roman mythos, Bacchus, also known as Dionysus, the son of Zeus and Semele, Bacchus was the god of wine and ecstasy. Now, this painting was first purchased by painter and art collector Giuseppe Cesari, and Caravaggio worked in Cesari's studio for several years. And the one thing that Caravaggio is allowed to paint in his studio was fruit and flowers. So if you look in this painting, the fruit and the flowers, they're on point. They're very beautifully done. And he didn't really enjoy just doing fruit and flowers, so he did want to break out on his own. But I thought this was an interesting history of this piece. Cesari's entire collection of art was confiscated by Pope Paul V because Cesari wouldn't sell the pieces at a reasonable price to the Pope's nephew, who was also an avid art collector, the Cardinal Borghese. So false charges were created. Cesari ended up having to basically give Cardinal Borghese 107 of his paintings as payment. And even though they were collected by ill-gotten gains, the Borghese Gallery in Rome is worth the trip to Italy just for the Bernini sculptures alone, and also the Caravaggios. So it is a beautiful collection. You can see most of it. And Cardinal Borghese continues to be a supporter of Caravaggio's work through this time and gets him out of trouble with the law as well. Okay, so once again, I mentioned that he did a lot of fruit and flowers. So he is really like pulling out all of his skill sets over here. This is Caravaggio's basket of fruit was seen as an extraordinary example of what a still life could be. And at this time, there were not a lot of still lifes. Most of the paintings are going to be figurative. There's going to be like a figure within them. And according to the lead art historian of that era, the 17th century, Giovanni Pietro Bellori, Caravaggio learned to paint flowers and fruit so well imitated that everybody came to learn from him and to create the beauty that is so popular today. He put the amount of detail into painting fruit that he would a human figure. So notice the use of shadow and realism portrayed. Working in Sarasi's studio probably helped him with this. And then the fruit, if you stare at it, you can see there's aging spots. They're not these pristine, beautiful pieces of fruit, which also plays with abundance and excess and maybe waste. So you're seeing, and you're also seeing the life and death of the fruit. There's like the decaying process in action. This is a random tangent, but there's a video piece that I really appreciate, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of this because it's called Still Life by Sam Taylor Wood, and it was 2001, and it's a time lapse. So it's a beautiful still life, and then it time lapses into that decaying process. So one of the homeworks for today is to check that out. You can kind of catch it on YouTube to see that. The banknotes from 1980s and 90s also included this fruit basket illustration on the back of the Italian banknotes as a homage to Caravaggio. And another side note is that 25 of Caravaggio's works are in the Google Arts and Culture. If you haven't explored Google Arts and Culture, I highly recommend it. So the way that they do the images is they take all these mini images and stitch them together to where you can zoom really far into the pieces. It's usually on the right side that you can zoom in. So you can zoom in to see the details of even like the paint peeling off in certain locations or cracking. And this is one of the pieces that is available on Google Arts and Culture. So if you Google that, you'll be able to get into Google Arts and Culture, and you just type whatever artist you're looking up, and a lot of pieces are on there. So Caravaggio left Sarasi's studio to work on his own, and the Cardsharp shows a more realistic scene of street life in Rome. He wanted to kind of expand to like a wider audience of what he was painting. There's a young man dressed well, and then there's the two card sharps that are cheats, and they are kind of fooling him. And this piece was it was purchased by Cardinal Del Monte, who was impressed with that level of detail. Now, Cardinal Del Monte played a pivotal role in Caravaggio's career, and he was his earliest patron, which means that he was able to live on Del Monte's property, and he was given room and board. He was able to just paint. And Del Monte set him up with a lot of church commissions as well. So the Musicians was painted to showcase Cardinal Del Monte's love for music, and it once held in Del Monte's music room in the Palazzo Madama. Caravaggio almost always used models for painting his work, which is one of the reasons why his work is so realistic. And the second boy from the right is most often thought to be another self-portrait of Caravaggio. They are tuning their instruments before a practice, and their mouths are open, which could be them maybe singing in harmony. And the young men are in classical dress, which once again references the Greco-Roman mythology. And it could also be a private concert at Del Monte's, which might have looked like this with singers in costume. The boy on the far left, however, is dressed as Cupid, and you can see his arrows. It's a little bit challenging to see in the dark. But there are arrows on his side, and he's also working with some fruit. So once again, we have fruit featured in the painting as well. And this painting is seen as an allegory for music and love. So I really like this piece, and it's in the Uffizi Museum in Florence. Medusa was commissioned by Cardinal Del Monte to be a gift to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, who was a member of the extremely powerful Medici family, and they were located in Florence, Italy. Del Monte was an ambassador to the Medici family, and this piece is round, but it's made to be worn like a shield. And so it's like one of those pieces that is almost conceptual. So if you're wearing it, then you become almost the hero that slays Medusa. So the wearer becomes the hero of the shield, becomes the hero, the slayer of Medusa, which would have been the Greek demigod Perseus. And Perseus used a shining shield to avoid looking at Medusa directly, because otherwise he would have been turned into stone, and then he ends up beheading her. So if decapitated heads are not your thing, you might not want to continue any further, because there is also one of Caravaggio's favorite things to paint. And once again, the face kind of resembles Caravaggio's in how it looks. So Italy at this time would not have been a unified nation as we think of today, but rather a series of kingdoms. So it didn't become unified until 1861. And Florence was its own thing. Rome was its own thing. The cardinals would have been papal nobility, and the Vatican being the papal state, and the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church. The cardinals were positions of power given by the Pope to prominent families. And I have a map later that kind of maps out where those kingdoms would have been. And interesting, around this time, Caravaggio begins to cause a little bit more trouble. He enjoyed late night trips and carrying his sword, which he was not licensed to do. In May 4th, 1598, he was arrested for his sword again and stated in court, "I was arrested last night because I was carrying a sword. I carry the sword by right because I'm the painter to the Cardinal del Monte. I am in his service and live in his house. I am entered on his payroll." So his working with the Cardinal, and even like Borghese, there's a lot of ways that he tries to get to do what he wants, and then just kind of hides under working for one of the cardinals. A lot of the police reports were discovered, and so you can even just Google Caravaggio and police reports, and there'll be some articles that pull up because they were able to find them and kind of decipher them, and it provides kind of a timeline of how bad he was. Very mischievous, but it's always fun to talk about. Okay, so the next one. Saint Catherine of Alexandria was martyred at the hands of Emperor Maxentius in the 4th century. And she's often called the Saint Catherine of the Wheel, and it's behind her. And the wheel was a torture device that was supposed to kill her, but once she touched it, it broke. And she was tortured for her Christian beliefs and was beheaded. Caravaggio's paintings often use the Italian courtesan Felice Maladroni as a model, and she will come up again. And the chiaroscuro treatment of light is a style of painting that Caravaggio becomes most notable for in his work. There's the strong contrast between light and dark, which impacted the European art world of the day. Chiaroscuro highlights the three-dimensionality of the figures in the painting, and Renaissance artists like Leonardo da Vinci would have started this technique. However, Caravaggio really pushed it to its limits. He really exaggerated the lights versus the darks. And so even if you look up the word chiaroscuro, it's going to pull up Caravaggio with it. And there's even a more specified term, which is tenebriism, which is what he does, where it's creating drama with this light and dark usage, which unfortunately, it makes it a little hard to see some of those details within the pieces. But I did want to write out the spellings for you if you wanted to do more research on the techniques. The Martyrdom of St Matthew was part of Caravaggio's first public commission to decorate the Sarasi Chapel in Rome, arranged by Cardinal del Monte. Cardinal Contarelli had already passed away, however, had requested the paintings in his chapel to include scenes of St. Matthew. We're going to go into another one next. And this one is of St. Matthew being murdered by a soldier sent by the king of Ethiopia. Hyrtacus, who was the king, had lusted after his niece, who was a nun, and St. Matthew was not so keen on that, and his disapproval ended up with him being killed during Mass with onlookers watching the scene in terror. These were the largest paintings in, these are the largest paintings that he's done so far at 10.5 feet by 11. And they helped establish Caravaggio as a leading painter of the Christian paintings for the Catholic Church. And the next one of St. Matthew. The Calling of St. Matthew is another for the Contarelli Chapel, and about the same size and scales as the Martyrdom of St. Matthew. And the Martyrdom began first, and then he had to work a little while to get the composition right. And so then he took a break, finished this one, and then went back to the first one. This piece depicts the Gospel of St. Matthew 9:9, and is one of the ones that I think of most when I think of Caravaggio, only because of the chiaroscuro painting techniques. So Matthew 9:9, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting in the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. And then Christ is pointing to Matthew, and Matthew is pointing to himself. So if you can see the figures with their hands pointed. However, they're not the most highlighted figures in the piece, which is really interesting. And you can see the money is on the table, and one of Matthew's hands is still counting the money. So he's in kind of a split moment in his life right in that picture. The figures look more like the everyday street life, like the Cardsharps, and it's set in this dark, grungy tavern and contemporary dress at the time. Caravaggio and other Baroque artists are interested in capturing that moment of spiritual awakening. And as part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, Baroque artists like Caravaggio were more naturalistic in their approach and their painting style, using everyday characters to win back some who had left to go to the Protestant church to hopefully come back to Catholicism. Though many of Caravaggio's pieces were rejected from the church for being too real and a little too controversial. So it was a delicate balance. Okay, so the Nativity with St. Francis and St. Lawrence was housed in the Oratory of St. Lawrence in Palermo, but stolen in 1969, most likely by the Sicilian Mafia. And the piece was cut with a razor out of its frame. So is anybody else cringing? Because that was one thing I was like, ah! There's a recording of the priest's experience, and he had received a letter that said, "We have the painting. If you want to make a deal, you have to submit an advert to the newspaper." And the priest worked with the authorities. They ended up doing a little advert in the paper. He received another letter with a small piece of the Caravaggio, kind of like how a kidnapping might send a thumb or something like that, but instead it's a piece of the painting. And it was a request for another advert to be made in the newspaper, but the authorities didn't want to comply, and the painting was never seen again. And so this is still on the FBI's top 10 unsolved art crimes, with the painting valued at $20 million. I just thought the history of that was fascinating. And after the piece was stolen, they just enlarged one of the, they had one color photograph of the piece. And if you know photography in the 1960s, the color is always weird. It probably was not the best at making a really large print. So Sky TV wanted to have it restored, and so they hired Bactum Art to work on a replication, and they used the references that they had. And you can visit bactumfoundation.org for more information on the recreation process and other projects that are all really cool. Okay, so this one's the Incredulity of St. Thomas, who you might know as Doubting Thomas. And this is according to St. John's Gospel that Jesus was resurrected, but one of his 12 disciples was not there to see him when he returned. So Jesus returned the following week and told Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." And this one looks so realistic, and with the detail of him pushing his finger into the side, and it makes me quite kind of squeamish. And it's another great view of the chiaroscuro technique being used because the light is kind of highlighting that scene in particular. Okay, so this one, we're back to more beheading. The Judith beheading Holofernes. Judith is modeled once again by our courtesans. So Felice Melandroni. In September 1599, Caravaggio had witnessed a public execution, which could have influenced this painting. The public execution was of Beatrice Cenci, who was beheaded with an axe. She had murdered her abusive father, Count Francesco Cenci, with the help of her siblings and a hammer. And there's a legend that the headless Beatrice haunts the bridge where she was executed on the night before the anniversary of her death, carrying her head, which is a little Halloween spookiness that kind of ties into this story. But back to Caravaggio and the Book of Judith. This is an Old Testament story, and it's the beautiful Jewish widow Judith. She frees the people from Israel from oppression by destroying the Assyrian general Holofernes. First, she goes to the enemy camp with her maid. So her maid is always pictured in these portrayals. And Holofernes was smitten by her beauty and had a little bit too much to drink, making him an easy target, which and providing the opportunity to kill him. And is quite a gruesome scene. And artists who mimicked the chiaroscuro style, similar to Caravaggio, were known as Caravaggisti. And Artemisia Gentileschi did her own rendition of Judith a while later, and she was from the Florence region, but then went to Rome to kind of study his style and then returned back to Florence. Artemisia was the female artist, which is why I wanted to show her work, kind of paralleling this story, since Judith was seen as a heroine. Okay, so the crucifixion of St. Peter. Peter was sentenced to death in Rome and requested to be crucified upside down since he felt he was unworthy to be killed the same way as Jesus. So this is one of the two pieces in the Sarasi Chapel in Rome, and it was commissioned by Sarasi, and he wanted to focus on the saints Peter and Paul. The model that was selected for St. Peter could have been just about anybody that you would find on this. He looks like an everyday character. He looks like someone you could find on the street. Very ordinary. But his reactions are very realistic as well. The nails are grotesquely visible going through the hands and the feet. And the weight of this action is physically seen. You can see the gravity. So you can tell that there's a piece of wood, there's a rope pulling it up. The guy is trying to hold it. His muscles are straining. There's another guy underneath and his leg muscles are straining, and he's barefoot and the feet are kind of pushing against that canvas, and you can tell how dirty his feet are. But the tension of this moment is very visible. And the parallel piece is Conversion on the Way to Damascus, and this is a diptych piece in the Sarasi Chapel. There was an earlier version that Sarasi rejected that was slightly busier in composition, so this is take two. And the conversion on the way to Damascus is the story of Saul, who had been persecuting the Christian community and becomes blinded by a light and hears the voice from Christ to follow him. Saul goes blind for 3 days, which is an important number in Christian theology, including the 3 days that Christ was in his tomb before being resurrected. Saul is then converted and becomes known as Paul, which was confusing to me at first, but he becomes known as Paul the Apostle. Saul is the Hebrew name, and then Paul is the Roman name. Acts 9, 3 through 9 is what this kind of follows. This story follows, and the light is shining directly on St. Paul's face, which is another piece where Caravaggio's tenebrism, the dramatic use of the chiaroscuro technique of lights and dark, is utilized so well, and light becomes the representation of the divine. So the light in the piece almost becomes another character within the painting. There's nothing actually that says that he fell off a horse. However, many of the paintings portray Saul falling off of a horse. It puts him in almost more of a vulnerable position. So he's got the horse's foot right above him, his helmet has fallen off, and there's a foreshortening of the figure that makes everything feel so much closer to that edge of the canvas, almost like it's being pressed up against the canvas. And I wanted to show a picture of what these pieces would have looked like in the chapel, so you can just see how big these pieces would have been and how they're pressing up against the space and how the viewer, you as the person in that space, would feel. It would be an experience for sure. In some ways, it breaks the fourth wall. And Caravaggio brings the divine into the everyday sphere physically, as well as using figures that look more contemporary into scenes depicting the divine. And many of Caravaggio's religious paintings are installed in churches and remain in these churches today. You can see how Caravaggio would have taken into consideration that viewer's perspective. All right, so Madonna of Loreto is in the Cavalletti Chapel of the Church of Sant Agostino, Rome, as another commission. And there's some similarities, I think, to the last piece as to this piece as well, just in the way, even like the one with St. Peter with the feet pushing up against the canvas. This, once again, the pilgrims that have traveled long distances, they're tired. They look very ordinary people. They're barefoot. The Madonna is, this is a different portrayal from Renaissance Madonna and Child. So Renaissance Madonna and Child, there's that distinct separation as of the divine and everyday. However, this Madonna and Child, she's just on a stoop. It looks like the outdoors of any place in Rome, and just kind of outside of her door. She's holding a child. The one noticeable difference is that she has that thin little sliver of a halo on her head. So she doesn't follow that long-standing iconographic tradition of Madonna and Child. And the figures are just filling that space once again. So we're going back to Caravaggio being a little mischievous. In 1605, Caravaggio assaulted a Vatican notary, and he was jailed for carrying a sword and dagger without license. And so Cardinal Borghese met Caravaggio when he was having the charges brought against him for assaulting the notary. A settlement was made. Caravaggio showed his appreciation to the cardinal by presenting this piece as a gift. So this is the gift of Saint Jerome writing. And Saint Jerome is depicted as a scholar transcribing the Bible into different languages to become more universal rather than just in Latin. And Caravaggio gives Saint Jerome minimal possessions. He's frail, he's an old man, the skull and his age are symbolic of death, as well as the word of God being eternal, so like everlasting. It's a beautiful piece. I just love the composition as well. It almost has like a triangular, like your eye flows very nicely within this piece. Okay, this is the map I was telling you about, just to kind of give a little example of where those kingdoms would have been. So this area would have all kind of been around here. And it may not be completely, I don't know what year this map would have been released, but I wanted to point out some of his travels because he gets in more trouble. So in 1606, Caravaggio has a match of palacorda, which is similar to tennis. And he had an argument between the artist and a member of the opposing team, Ranuccio Tomasoni, and it got heated. It turned into a duel. And though Caravaggio was badly injured, Tomasoni was dead. And Caravaggio had cut Tomasoni's upper thigh at the femoral artery. And now the courtesan that was often the subject of Caravaggio's work of St. Catherine and Judith, she was romantically involved with Tomasoni, who was of a noble family. So there is a lot of disagreement on what caused the fight. So it could have been a woman. It could have been a gambling debt. It could have been just accidentally something happened. He's quick-tempered anyways, and then they start to duel. And the death could have been accidental. He might not have wanted to actually kill him, but just maybe brandish his sword about like he was often did. So Pope Paul V condemned Caravaggio to death, and if beheading as a proof would have been fine as well. And so Caravaggio went on the run. First, he escaped to Naples. So you can find Rome, then you find Naples, and then he went to Malta to receive protection from the Knights of Malta. He was briefly a knight in obedience, but then he started some fight with a higher ranking knight, and then he was stripped of knighthood, imprisoned. Then he escaped. He went back to Naples. In 1609, he was severely wounded in a tavern brawl in Naples. And then according to the Smithsonian, there's evidence that Caravaggio died of an infected sword wound at the age of 38, perhaps at the hands of the knight. And they messed up his face really badly, but it took a while for the infection and fever to set in. He ended up dying in Porto Ercole. I'm not sure how I pronounce that. It's Ercole, which is part of Tuscany and northern Italy. And so the works before his death, that period before his death, share the story of him seeking papal pardon or protection. And so he fled to Naples under the protection of the Colonna family and received this commission for the Piemonte della, I'm not going to even try and pronounce that. There's a chapel for a charitable organization. And the 7 works of mercy depicts the 7 corporal works of mercy in the Catholic belief to address the needs of the poor. So there's bury the dead, visit the imprisoned and feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, clothe the naked, visit the sick and refresh the thirsty. The setting is in an Italian piazza or town center, and this is his first commissioned masterpiece since he went on the lam. And while this depicts charity of this organization, kind of pairing up the piece to where it's going to be located, it can also be seen as Caravaggio's own plea for mercy. And Salome, with the head of John the Baptist, was sent from Naples to the Knights of Malta to gain favor. And this region was under Spanish rule, so I think that's why it's now in Madrid. This biblical narrative is that Salome, stepdaughter of King Herod, seductively danced for the king and is given the head of John the Baptist as a gift. The executioner is looking behind his shoulder, and he's looking remorseful. It's kind of a somber, sad piece. And the plated head looks a lot like Caravaggio's face. So this is the last piece that I'm going to feature. So 1610, Caravaggio painted David with the head of Goliath for Cardinal Borghese. So if you remember him, he has a really great collection. He's gotten him out of trouble before. He's the nephew of the Pope, Paul V, and he's hoping to receive that papal pardon, which did happen. However, Caravaggio dies before he's able to return to Rome. And this piece may have been a double self-portrait. The young David looks like a young Caravaggio, and he looks also very sad and remorseful rather than some of the other portrayals of David and Goliath. And the Goliath figure resembles an older Caravaggio pre-night fight in the tavern. So his face is still not disfigured. And there are many more Caravaggio works that I didn't dive into, and a lot more analysis that you can do, but please put questions in the chat box. I do have some suggested reads. So these are all in the library collection. We have one that's Baroque painting. It's by Behrens, and it's one of the ones. It's a thicker read, but it's a lot of imagery. So if you're interested, that it covers 2 centuries worth of Baroque paintings. If you're wanting a little bit more of the heist, this is Daniel Silva's The Heist, and it is featuring Silva's Gabriel Alon, who is a spy and an art historian, which can't get better than that. And the stolen painting is Caravaggio's Nativity with St. Francis and St. Lawrence, which was that painting that was never found that may have been stolen by the mafia. So what's really interesting is that a story like that can really create the backdrop of a great spy novel. And the last one is just a fun, it's young adult title, and it's called Caught, Nabbing History's Most Wanted by Georgia Bragg, which includes Caravaggio, Al Capone, Blackbeard, and plenty more. The next program is Impressionist painter and printmaker Mary Cassatt, and that's going to be November 10th at 2 p.m. Central Time. It's also going to be through Zoom. And I really love exploring her use of printmaking and influences with the Japanese Edo prints. So I am gonna dive into that probably a little bit more than her Impressionist works, but I will cover a little bit of everything.